Okay, we're going to start putting our Kickstarter assembly together. I think I mentioned this before, but I'm using the Climber manual. This is good for 98 to 2002. They're all pretty close. There is some differences, so just keep an eye out for little things. But that's our Kickstarter assembly. This guy here, it's got a snap ring right there, and then it's got a washer, then it's got the gear, and then another washer. I had no reason to take that apart, so that's still all together. So your spring's going to go first, and then your starter ratchet, and then again that snap ring, washer, gear, and next washer, they're all already together. Then on the other end, you're going to have number 3, which is a collar, 2 is your spring, of course, and then you should have another washer. And if you're watching the other videos I have on this, whoever was in here before, I know I probably said this 3 times already, but they did not do a very professional job at all. I already had to buy 3 thrust washers, and now it looks like I may have missed this guy too. So I got to see. It may be in my bag of tricks still in the box. But so anyhow, going to start. We're going to install this guy here. He just goes back in there, and you got to bolt, get that guy in there first, and then we can start setting our spring and other pieces. Okay, so now we can go ahead and get this guy lined up. You should have a couple marks on here. Let's see if that'll focus. Right there you should see a little dot, and somewhere in this guy, it looks like right there, you're going to have another dot. Make sure you line them up. You'll be able to tell if you're one tooth off either way. It's pretty significant, so you'll know that you're lined up. But that's important. If not, you'll have problems when you're going to kickstart, and then you'll be taking it back apart. So now take your spring, set it in here. Got this guy bolted in already. Okay, one thing I want to point out when you're putting your kicker back together, when you're setting, once you get this all together and you're setting this down in place, be very careful that this guy here that we lined up the 2 dots with, make sure as you're putting in, it gets a little tricky and it's going to slide out of your hands. Make sure that it doesn't kick over, one tooth either way, or you'll definitely have some issues. And the other thing you want to be sure of as you're setting it in place, your kick guide right here, as you're setting this down into the hole, you can see that little lever right there, for lack of a better term, where that comes to a point right there. That has to get underneath that kick guide once you set it down in. Then you'll know you're in your proper place, and then you can go ahead and tension up your spring. I'm going to take this spring and I'm going to wrap it around, and it's going to set in this hole right here. Make sure that guy spins freely once you get everything in place. Okay, we're going to go ahead and install our idler gear now. First we have to install our washer. This is one of the new ones I had to end up getting. and then just take your gear and slide that on there. This gear is identical on both sides, so not an issue whatever way you want to put it. That's it. Okay, so our next step, we're going to get our outer case on. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to take this guy out and get him out and just clean it up, make sure there's nothing in there that's going to bind it up. Doesn't appear that there will be. It's pretty free as I spin that, but you should check it. Maybe put a little bit of oil on it. Basically going to remove that Phillips screw, and then that should slide right out, and clean it up. As always, pay attention to your orientation. That's the way the arm has to go back in, with the little notch going to the right. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Going to check these bearings, lube these bearings up, clean up a little bit of the old gasket material, and then start putting this guy back together. Okay, one of the other things we have to do is we're going to have to break down this water pump a little bit further, because there is some seals behind here that come with the kit that should be changed. And they're pretty important because they keep things from getting mixed up, your oil and your water, your coolant, which will obviously cause your problems. So I don't recommend skipping that step. I would love just to start reassembling right now, but for a couple of $5 seals, you don't want to leave it like that. So you're going to take this top plate off, and then right here you're going to remove the impeller. That's not a nut, it's actually part of the impeller. In fact, that's not as smooth as I would like, so I'm going to check that out when I have it open. But yes, there's a couple of seals behind here, so you're going to want to replace them. Pay attention to the orientation of the seals. Make sure that you put the new ones in the proper way, because they are different on each side. Can't really see it, but yeah, I guess maybe you can see that. That's one of the seals there, but I believe there's two in there once you get this apart. This gear will pull out once you get this impeller off. There's a couple flat spots on this gear spindle. I'm just using a pair of needle nose vice grips. Don't go overboard with it. You don't want to mar that up, but give yourself something to hold on to. Then you're going to take your 10mm socket and get on the front of that impeller, and that should loosen up for you. Okay, so we got the impeller off. There's a better look at it. Like I said, it's actually not a nut, that's part of the impeller. And just a little bit of a warning, this comes off kind of hard, so don't expect it to spin off real easily. Though I don't see any residual Loctite. It almost felt like it had Loctite on there, but I got to check the book to see if it calls for Loctite. But it didn't come off exactly easy, but once it broke free, then it wasn't bad. Behind that is a washer, so keep an eye out for that guy. And then your gear. And now there's a look at our seals. I'm going to check on my kit, but I'm certain that they're in there. I believe there's one here and one behind it. Okay, so there's your two seals. They're two different sizes. The bigger one is the first one I took out, and the smaller one is obviously the second one I took out. And this one here is going to go, I'll call this the open end for lack of a better term. This is the end where you can stick something in there if you wanted to. That open end on the smaller one goes down, and then the larger one, the open end, faces upwards. Something else I discovered on this, and I didn't see this in the book. I didn't necessarily look for it either. But if you can see right where I'm pointing with the screwdriver. You probably can't, but there's a hole in the race where the seal goes, and if you look on the outside here, there's also a hole, and I was curious to see if that went all the way through, so I got a bread tie, and from the outside it was plugged with dirt solid. It almost looked like it was sealed with putty or something, but it was actually just dirt. But as you can see now, I can push that all the way through and you can see it coming out. So I would clean that out. I don't know if that's a weep hole, if the seals go bad, or if that's a way to let you know that might even be a weep hole for the water pump. I know on cars they actually have a weep hole, and that lets you know that the water pump's going bad. So I'm assuming that's what it is. I'm going to look in the book, but figured I'd mention that. Okay, so we got our first seal in, and just take a look at how I have this case orientated. I'm working from this end, so your first seal goes with the, again, I'm calling it the open part facing down, so this flat side you're looking at, and now your next seal, your bigger one, is the open end is going to face you. So in other words, the flat side and the flat side are both going to, they're basically going to be touching each other. And this slotted end or open end will be facing towards you. And this one here is facing away from you. Just make sure that's set in there all the way. I already drove it in there with the socket, but just double checking it. That one there pushed in pretty easy. Be careful when you try to drive this one in here, because the way it's facing, there's like a metal spring that's inside of these, so just be delicate with it. This one actually, it's set in there pretty much all the way, so I'm just going to give it a couple taps. Okay, so you should only have one seal left, and that's going to be the seal for the Kickstarter. This is going to be like most of your seals would go, with the flat side facing out. Okay, we're going to start putting our water pump back together. Make sure you put your new gaskets on. Make sure you get the old gasket off, obviously. Make sure you got a clean surface. Just putting a little grease on here to give it, the gasket, something to grab to. Okay, so you got your first gasket on, you got your impeller on. Make sure you get your washer on before you put the impeller on. I used a little bit of a medium strength Loctite, and the book calls for, I just saw the spec somewhere. No, I don't see it right this second, but it's in the book. It's by inch pound, so I did it by feel. I just got it tight and gave it a little bit more because I don't have anything that goes down to inch pounds. But I don't recommend going really tight with it because it is an impeller and it has to move freely. So I use a little bit of medium strength Loctite on it. I didn't use a lot, just enough to make me feel better that it's not going to loosen up. So you got your first gasket on. We're going to take this guy here. Line up your dowel pins. Got one there, one there. That guy should fall in place and it should look like that. Then you got your next gasket, and then after that you got your cover. Okay, so once you got your second gasket on, go ahead and place your cover in place. You got 4 bolts for the cover. The 2 longer ones are going to go in afterwards once we get the case back on the motor, but for now you can get your 2 smaller ones started. Just make sure you're putting them in the right spot. This hole here and this hole here is obviously for the longer ones. So you're going to want to put your short ones, one there and one there. Okay, so now you go ahead and you put your governor gear in place. Just drop it in, it'll fall in place. Make sure your arm here is lined up correctly, and at this point we have our gasket laying in place. Use a little bit of grease to hold it down. Now we're going to take our water pump gear and our governor gear. Where am I? And we're going to try to get that to fall into place into these 2 bearings. And then once you get it in place, you can start putting your bolts in and bolting it down. Okay, so once you get your case in place, just double check, make sure your gasket's even all the way around. Make sure your governor's good, make sure that's moving. And now you're ready to start placing the bolts in, going all the way around, and you can go ahead and secure that. Also at this point, as you're putting this cover on, you can also put your 2 long water pump bolts in at this point. Okay, also wanted to point out that where your power valve arm is, there's a rubber cover that goes in here, and it's best to slide it in place before you put these together. I didn't, only because I didn't realize what tough shape mine was in. I don't know if you can see that, but the inside's all chewed up, and basically when I slide mine in and I put the cases on, because there's nothing to grab on the back side of this, it just keeps popping out. It's in really tough shape. So anyhow, I'm going to order a new one. You can get them in afterwards. You just have to kind of be careful. You got to take a small screwdriver and kind of press it in, and then it'll eventually pop in. So I'll get that in afterwards. I just want to point that out. I got all the bolts tightened on the case now. Again, I didn't use a torque wrench on these because it's a real low setting. I just tighten them up until they feel snug, give it a little extra, if you will, and you know, call it a day. If you got the proper torque wrench, I definitely recommend it. I pretty much torqued everything down to spec on this except for the smaller stuff, because my torque wrench doesn't go down that low. So yeah, we're going to go ahead and put our clutch cover on now and bolt that down. Same thing, snug them, give them a little extra turn, and should be good to go. Also want to mention real quick too, make sure you put a new gasket on your clutch cover. Mine's brand new because before we ended up with this bottom end problem, I actually put new clutch plates in, and I put a new gasket in then. So this one's brand new. But if yours was old, definitely put a new one in if it came with the kit. If it didn't, I recommend ordering one separately. I want to point something out on this power valve assembly. I had problems with this in the past when the motor originally locked up, getting this thing back in time. And I'm not sure that timed is the proper term, but this is your power valve assembly. That's how much play you have in it. So when you get this all back together, you have to get this linkage back on that stud right there. And as you can see, I'm too high. And if I move the power valve, I'm way too high. And there's a little spacer that goes on, and then there's a cotter key, but that's in the bag over here. So here's the issue. If you don't have, when you're looking at this view here, this arm, if you don't have that in the proper place, it's not going to line up. And in order to fix that, you have to have this whole side casing off, not the main cases that you have to split, just this side case. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and I'll show you the position that it's actually supposed to be in. I'm off like 1. Okay, so looking at your motor in this direction, just for a reference, there's your water pump. So when you're looking at it like that, your power valve assembly, this guy right here, when you're looking at it straight up and down, should be a little bit at an angle. It shouldn't be perfectly straight up and down in the middle. It definitely shouldn't be this way. It should be a little bit this way, to the right as you're facing it, as you can see there. You'll know you have it in the right spot because once you do, that pin right here, this arm has to be setting against it, just like it is. There might be a very slight gap there, but if you look close enough, it's actually setting against it. If you have it in the wrong spot, it could be just off of that by 1/8 of an inch, but it's enough where it's going to mess you up. You should be able to very easily put your arm in place, put your spacer in there, and then put your cotter key in there. And that's the position the cotter key has to be. It should look like, well, yep, there we go. Should look just like. Okay, finally got the motor back in, exhaust is installed, and we're ready for our first cold start. Alright, she's running.